All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Erasmus, and welcome to the Shaft Sports. Today, we're going to bring you another episode of the Shaft Sports, the home of intellectual sports conversations and updates. And I would like to ask a very, very simple question for today's episode. What has happened to loyalty in sports? What has happened to loyalty in sports? And today, what I'll be doing is taking a deep dive into some of the issues which has come out this week concerning players like Alexander Isak, Yoane Wissa, players like Xavi Simons who are looking to exit their clubs, and we're seeing a lot of drama and controversy around player movements. I would say this used to be a regular occurrence during the transfer seasons, and we've seen a lot of transfer saga. But I think the question over here is why are we seeing a rise in players taking some of this initiative? I would like to hear from you within the comments your answer to this question, whether there's still loyalty in football and where this is headed to. We would also like to encourage all of you, a lot of our listeners who listen to us, do not subscribe to the podcast. I think when you do subscribe, it helps the channel grow further and it helps you stay informed with regards to all of our new episodes which we bring in. All right, so let's dive into today's episode. And the question for today is, in football today, does loyalty mean anything? Within the week, we saw that Alexander Isak released a statement from his social media account where he made a number of claims. I'm not going to read the entire report, but the summary of it, and if you don't know about the transfer saga with Alexander Isak, I'll just ask you to Google. But just to give you a little bit of context, Alexander Isak is a striker for Newcastle United who has asked or claims to have asked to leave the club this summer. There's been reported interest strongly from Liverpool FC, who obviously have gaps within their attack, which they would like to fill. Now, Alexander Isak is one of the top strikers within the English Premier League. I think last season was the second highest goal scorer and therefore a well sought after talent. And I think that off the back of last season, finishing with Newcastle and winning the Carabao Cup, and also managing to qualify into the Champions League, there was a lot of hope and expectation that Newcastle in itself as a club and as a brand was rising, and Alexander Isak was taking them on his wings. However, within this summer, he has asked to leave the club. And this did not just stop here, but this has developed into one of the transfer sagas of all time, probably. And where we have seen this play out mostly is also within social media. So that's something that we're also going to look at. I think if you read his report, one of the things that he also mentions is that there was a gentleman's agreement with Newcastle. And also, for the very first time, we are seeing Newcastle as an institution and as a club actually come out and comment on the issue. And I think their statement was also very, very interesting. So stay tuned. So we're going to be taking a deep dive into this, look at other similar examples, and ask ourselves what loyalty means. Where does loyalty stand in today's football, given that this is a crucial element of football? We love, I as a Chelsea fan, adore Eden Hazard, but we obviously had to face such a situation. And when we see players play on the field, we like to imagine that they'll be with us forever. We want them to be club legends. We want the best for them. We wish them all of the best. And why is it that when they choose to leave, they do so in this way and they do so in this very manner? So I think it's something that would be very interesting for us to ask. All right. I want to ask three questions over here or discuss three things. First of all, the gentleman's agreement versus the contracts, because I think the question that has been on a lot of people's minds is, why would you sign a gentleman's agreement if there is the option to sign a full-term contract? And it doesn't seem wise that these players consistently choose the gentleman's agreement when they could put that within the clause. I think clearest case or the example we could give was with Moises Caicedo, when uh, Chelsea made an offer to buy him from Brighton, said there was a gentleman's agreement to sell. However, Brighton was unwilling to sell. We also saw with Harry Kane, which was big news when he said there was a gentleman's agreement that he would be asked to leave, but we saw the Saga drag out to the end of the window before he finally moved for over 100 million euros to Bayern Munich. So what does it mean? What exactly is gentleman's agreement? Why do players continue to trust them? Do clubs honor them or not? What it means, and should fans sympathize with such agreements? I think first of all, with gentleman's agreements, you can't think of it like a verbal agreement or word of mouth, which is exchanged between two parties who enter into a contract. I think verbal agreements, especially within the UK, are also enforceable to a certain degree, but it does require a threshold of evidence in order to prove that indeed there was such verbal agreements. And I think for me, what is also very, very interesting to recognize in this case is that Newcastle say there was no gentleman's agreement, which is the very problem that comes with gentleman's agreements. I find it very hard, from a personal opinion, to see why Isak is going to reference a gentleman's agreement when there was really nothing like that. So I find it very, very hard to believe the stance of Newcastle that there was no gentleman's agreement. And more, if I look at the situation, what it seems to me is that perhaps the agreement was contingent on certain clauses, and those clauses have not yet been fulfilled. And I think it's quite clear also within the statement of Newcastle, which hopefully will be also be showing on your screen, that there are certain conditions for which this deal necessarily needs to follow in order for the gentleman's agreement to be activated. So if I put these two together, I think that perhaps the story lies in some form of agreement which has been set, certain conditions which are required in order to fulfill it. And I find holes or gaps within Newcastle's story that there is no such agreement. But that is also the problem with gentleman's agreements. Like I mentioned, you need to be able to evidence it. And once the clear lines were not stipulated in here, it is very, very, very difficult to prove whether this has been fulfilled, even if you can prove that such an agreement was in place. So people ask, why don't you set contracts? Why don't you set uh, contracts? And I think this is a very, very fair question. If it is known in the past that gentlemen's agreements in themselves do not uh, move the needle, or that they can be reneged on, why do we still use them? First, I mean, there could be lots of reasons, and well, of course, we do not have full details of what this information is, but what we've seen consistently is that gentleman's agreements is usually used when there is some form of flexibility. Both parties do want some form of flexibility with regards to the clause. When it comes to contracts, these are clear and written down. And I think that once they are clear and written down, it is very, very hard to push against clauses which goes against you. And and so for the want of wiggle room, when both parties see that, well, there can be some wiggle room, we should keep it soft so that any of us can come out of it, which most, just like most gentlemen's agreements, almost relies on having the conversation again to say, hey, we had an agreement so and so, do you think it's time to revisit that kind of thing, and then be able to get out of it? And the hope for both parties is that there is some wiggle room and there is some sort of good faith to be able to negotiate for new outcomes based on that. So in those moments, you would, I think the reason why both parties would also want that wiggle room is the level of uncertainty which does exist. And it's one of the things which I'm going to be discussing when we look at how both sides do respond to such a situation. So that could explain why players do fall for it, because the willingness of the club to write some of these things into core agreements is something that won't happen. And I'm trying to get a clear analogy to be able to bring over here. Your landlord can say, well, if maybe inflation is a problem and we've seen recent price hikes, I do not have a desire to hike the price of houses. However, if inflation doesn't go up, or however, if the prices of houses do not go up, I'll try not to increase the rent. I'll try. So this is a verbal agreement that we've had. But it may be that um even though the price of houses have not skyrocketed or increased, there may be certain conditions which has made the standard of living difficult or the prices of homes difficult. And therefore, when you come back to say, well, house prices have not risen and therefore you need to reduce my rent or not increase it, the landlord can say, well, I didn't foresee some of these circumstances, and that's why we had a gentleman's agreement to be able to have that level of flexibility. So in essence, it is not a sure banker. And I find it weird that players always try and rely on this in order to get out of those contracts, given that this wiggle room sometimes is something that they concede to, knowing that if the situation is tough, the other party can use. And in this situation, it is quite clear. And I think it is fair, and I want us to now talk about the contract situation and also look at the attitude, start looking at some of the attitude of these players. It is fair, and clubs need to look out for their own interest, which means that they need to maximize the outcomes on their side in terms of any agreement with anyone. If we think about it, the player is an employer. And at the end of the day, they are going to take their paycheck and they are going to leave. The long term sustainability of the club is the responsibility of the stakeholders who are stuck in there, and their lives depend on this, their careers depend on this. Not that they can't also leave, but I think they have way more long term interest than the players. So I do not subscribe to a world where clubs also do not look out for themselves. They would also want to protect their asset value and not just player loyalty in this instance. So I think uh, 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 in such situations where you also see that Alexander Isak, for example, has downed his tools, and we're going to talk about it extensively. He still has a contract that, I mean, there's a disagreement over the gentleman's agreement, which is fine, but there's still other parts of the contract which is hard coded, that you must turn up to training, that you must play football games, which if you do not do, there are consequences. But I think he's really at a point where he's happy to take some of those consequences, and clearly it will not augur well for Newcastle. But secondly, if you do look at some of the terms of the gentleman's agreement, which has been purported within the media, they have also not been fulfilled, right? They have not been fulfilled. For example, Newcastle has struggled to sign players, and Alexander Isak can say, well, that is not my problem, but that's a very, very easy thing to say. um, they have not been able to sign players, and they tried to sign João Pedro. This was taken away by Chelsea. Liam Delap taken away by Chelsea. They tried to sign Yoane Wissa. Brentford are not going to let them go. Brentford is putting a very, very high valuation on Wissa. They also tried to sign Brian Mbuemo, who also refused them. So it's quite clear that they have made efforts to create those conditions for Alexander Isak to leave. But those conditions have not happened, and therefore they also stand in their rights based on the contract which Isak himself has signed, and also based on the terms of the gentleman's agreement. And if you look at this also in the long term, you remember that Isak re-signed a contract, which is what makes it weird. And I think that's also one of the questions that I've been getting about this. Why do they keep on signing those new contracts, which puts them in a bind? Because we have seen in contrasting cases with McGahey and then Eberechi Eze of Crystal Palace, that these guys are in the last term of their contracts. So people say, yeah, well, they could have, like, why is Isak behaving this way? They can behave like Eze, like these guys are in the last term of their contract. So they have a lot of leverage in saying, well, if you don't let me go now, you lose all of the money. But in this instance, the leverage is with the club. because Alexander Isak signed a new contract that keeps him there for 3 more years, which means they have leverage over you and you are contracted to them for 3 years and you can't hope to sit on the bench for 3 years. But in Eze's case, they can play for 1 year and then go for free. So I think both of these things are very, very different. But as to why these players sign these contracts, most of the time, this is because they are able to come to agreements which help them in the short term with the hope of having some of these gentleman's agreements or clauses which allows them to leave later. So I was explaining this the other time that sometimes when players do sign the initial contract, the of course you want to be with the club. Like you received, let's say you are Moises Caicedo, you came from Ecuador, you want to stay with the club for long. You don't know how you're going to perform and you don't know what the future is going to look like. So under those conditions, you also do not have the power to negotiate for a lot of things. So and especially when you look also at the rules governing football, for example in La Liga there is a clear release clause, but I think FIFA has certain, I think FSR rules, which generally guides transfers, but there are local adaptations to these. So in most instances, people do not put in clauses for their release clause or any strong exit clauses. So when they realize that their stock is rising, most of them see this as an opportunity to be able to, um, one, bump their salary, and two, create conditions which would allow them to exit. In most situations, you would realize that the club still has some bit of power, and therefore it is reasonable to come to an agreement with them over terms of a sale rather than fight with them. Because if you fight with them, you still are sitting on the initial contract, and which has a lower salary, and you still have to play out the rest of your contract anyway, and there is no guarantee that you still be good to make the big move that you want. So in those situations, they find it more amicable to sign that new contract, which sort of gives them some of the power back on the basis of their performance, which means that the club either gets to pay them more money. Sometimes they sign clauses to say, you are going to match my highest bidder, right, for my salary, or I leave, right? Those kind of clauses just helps them to go through. But clearly, the clubs are doing something here because they do not make it very, very easy for these players to leave. And the kind of clauses which just shows that even when you do sign the agreements, like what, or you do sign the contracts, like what Moises Caicedo did, like what Isak did, there's still no clear guarantee of what your exit is going to look like at the end of the day. Cool. I want to move on. Let me know what you think at this point, whether I've been able to explain very well the idea behind gentleman's agreement and then uh, uh, legal binding agreements and how clubs use them. But the second thing I want to talk about is how these things drag out in public. Because it does look like, especially in the Alexander Isak situation, the public is split on this. So it is very interesting. Why does it feel like every transfer saga is played out live on social media? One person who has been fingered in all of this is Fabrizio Romano. I actually saw a video which claims that Fabrizio Romano acts as an agent for some of these players, and I am not surprised because also as a journalist, what he wants is information. But it's quite clear that he has built the audience where he can sway and influence um, the fans. And I'm sort of giving away my answer to this question over here. But the reason why we're beginning to see more and more of these things play out on social media is exactly because of the culture of football in today's day and age. We are seeing fans have a real influence on their clubs through social media. It's not a joke that most of the time the targets, um, the players who end up targeted by clubs are players whom fans have been crying out for on social media, mostly because you would expect that fans are important stakeholders of the club, and therefore clubs make an effort to try and reach out to them in many ways. And these days, the easiest way to do so is through social media. And that is how come you now see both sides try to tell their stories through social media. We've seen with Yoane Wissa and also with Xavi Simons, them delete all records of the club from their accounts to send a signal. The reason they also do so is because sometimes there are specific legal agreements which you don't want to break. Like, for example, if you don't go to training, is actual fines, and the fines may be hefty, or you may actually be pulled to court to pay compensation for loss, given that you have signed an initial contract. So they send these signals to show that they're unhappy, and that usually happens when there have been conversations which have gone on, and clearly there's no leeway, and therefore they weighed in on the public. They leverage the public to weigh in on the conversation, to act as judge and jury, and they know that clubs care about their own reputation. Players also care about their reputation. So we've seen it go both sides. We've seen clubs start to leak to the press also anyway. And what's funny is when people talk about the behavior of players, I also want to point out the behavior of clubs, especially in this era, which makes me set the original question: where is loyalty, or what place does loyalty have within modern day football? Because we've seen, for example, Erasmus Hoyland, who, yes, obviously had a challenging season last season for many reasons, which you can attribute to himself and also to external conditions. However, he's been a good servant of the club, and especially within this preseason, has shown a desire to stay with the club and continue with them. But we have seen Manchester United freeze him out of the squad, almost tried to kick him out of the squad, which is a very strange feeling. And Chelsea has also been culpable for this. On the very first game for Enzo Maresca's season, he put Sterling on the bench and said, "I no longer want him." What does this mean for players who have built their career reputation, signed a contract, and looking forward to be able to express their sporting dreams within a club? What happens when they are frozen out? Because we've seen in all clear instances that once you're frozen out, and I'm not saying that all of these guys are performing at their best, but as a player, you have no control over certain circumstances. It could be an injury which starts affecting your performance. And in those instances, if you are dropped by your club, we have seen that your reputation drops so low that you are unable to make the extra big step, maybe except if you are Sterling and you still get Arsenal. And I mean, but Arsenal goes for anyone anyway. But no, away from that. I think the key thing here is that you see the careers of these players tank, where they go to teams which are a tier below, sometimes two tiers below the clubs which they previously were in, and their careers are seriously affected. And if we do not see a rematonda like how it was seen with Anthony at Real Betis, these guys' careers go nowhere, and eventually tank, or they do not get the exposure and the hype. So it is not just a case of players who are rebelling. It seems something is happening where everyone is bothered or cares more about their own interest above anything else. So I know I did argue in the beginning that clubs also need to protect their own interest, but it does look like players are also concerned more about their own interest. And this is worrying, especially within the Premier League, which has a sort of a level of social culture and tradition to it, and the entire tradition of football, which is based around loyalty. For most fans, they are going to tell you that the club that they support since they were kids is one they supported till now. Like I was with a mate at Chester FC, and this club literally died and had to be reformed again. And he's still with the club, showing his loyalty. He cannot change to go and support Wrexham. You cannot change from supporting Tottenham to go and support Chelsea. Fans do not have the option and the luxury of switching up in terms of loyalty. But in this situation, we are seeing clubs checking out, we are seeing players also checking out and also care only about themselves, leaving fans in the middle. What do we do as fans? Why do we get caught in between? What do we do in these situations? Because loyalty, and this leads me to my third point, loyalty is a fading currency. And what does the future of sports look like? And I think loyalty used to be that badge of honor, but I am not sure it is valuable in today's currency. I'm not sure it is valuable in today's currency, and it's a valuable currency in today's football world, or in the landscape of sports today. And you see sports moving now to players forming individual brands, over branding for the team, because at first it was the club first, and then these players were seen as part of the club, and it was a privilege to play for the club, and players wanted to stay playing at the club. We saw Alan Shearer play out his whole career for Newcastle, although he was, not to say that Newcastle wasn't a big club, but he stayed there, and him playing for longer and then being able to retain the talent is what made them a big club. We saw that with Manchester United for a long while. But I think the very first example of this level of individualism came from Cristiano Ronaldo, who saw himself as a brand and viewed his career independent of the club. He was very okay moving around, and it's not just in the moving around, because you say same for Lionel Messi, but in the end, he became an independent brand on his own. And we saw that even when he moved clubs, a lot of Barcelona supporters sort of had sympathy for PSG, although there's some was this weird relationship which they had to tolerate. And we didn't used to have to do that. Like when Figo moved from Barcelona to Real Madrid, we all saw the vitriol that it was faced with. But these days, players are able to move across clubs very easily because of this very individualistic mindset in there. But on the flip side, clubs have also begun treating players like assets in a portfolio. Uh, when they think your value is going down, they are willing to offload you. They are even willing to put you, like for example, where um, Darwin Nunes, there were reports that he didn't want to go to Saudi, but essentially the club thought these were the guys who are willing to pay your price. And we saw it with Osimhen also, where Saudi came around and the clubs just thought, we want you to go to where we earn the biggest money. We don't care about your sporting objective. Of course, it requires the signature of the player also, but they try as much as possible to push the limits in these instances where we've seen the deals tank when they are not able to come to a level of agreement. We've seen the bomb squads created in United, created in Chelsea, which I've already referenced, where these players are treated just like assets in a portfolio. So so it is quite clear what is going on. We've even seen, especially now as the clubs are also becoming more of a business enterprise, a topic which we've already discussed. We've seen how they are very, very quick to move on with players. And fans, in a way, even though I've said we are the most loyal, are also not loyal to players. Immediately they are formed debts, we are very ready to move on, get the next player in. So I think this is the new era of fandom. Do not fall in love with, I always have the statement, do not fall in love with a lone player. But do not fall in love with these players, because I think more and more we are going to be seeing more of this cross carpeting of players across clubs, even established ones who have previously shown loyalty. Um, and we are going to see clubs continue to treat players in this way. But what in the end, what happens to loyalty? What's the future of loyalty within this entire equation? Because fans still romanticize it, and clubs and players know that fans demand it because it is very crucial for the game. Without this level of loyalty, if fans are able to easily cross carpet, I'm telling you, some clubs would not exist. Like the club I mentioned, Chester FC, my friend told me it literally exists based on fan donations and fan ownership. And I mean, not every situation is that extreme. Global brands like Manchester United perhaps still have other sponsorships, but it only happens or they only get that because of the fans. So, because of the demand still for loyalty, what we are now seeing is engineered loyalty. Now, if you open up the contracts of some of these players, you're beginning to see things like loyalty bonuses. You're beginning to see things like loyalty clauses, number of games played, um, and for example, with Neymar, I think there was a loyalty bonus which was mentioned that he gets to be able to spend some time away in Brazil once in a season, whilst the season is ongoing. It was, and there's been some crazy demands in order to. I heard there was a clause where he had to club. But I mean, all of these things are rumors and not confirmed. Um, there was a clause where he goes to the fans and he has to clap after match games and things like that. And you have these shows of loyalty. And I think the cloth is sort of coming down over them, and fans are beginning to see that, wait, you guys are actually not loyal. All of you are pretending. or putting in certain incentives in order for them to show loyalty. So is that sustainable in the long run? I think that is a key question to ask. I I don't, and this is me coming to a close over here. Um, I think that as fans, perhaps we can also get a bit more selfish. I don't think, as much as it is important that we show a level of loyalty, but I think we need to be able to move with the sports in this way. We need to be able to accept when a player is no longer able to stay and play with us and quickly move on. um I think it is sort of like all in all relationships, it is the expectations which causes the hurts. If you do understand that these players are only with you for a short while and they may go, it helps to deal with that. Of course, it doesn't mean don't give them the support, but I've always said that once a player wears your shirt, he has all of my support. Once he wants to go, he's free to go. And to be fair, I think that's the position that a lot of Newcastle fans have taken, and it's so sad to see the situation devolved to this level. But I thought, with so many examples of this happening, with Garnacho to Chelsea, with Sancho to Roma, Renato Vega with Chelsea, it's important to start having these forms of conversations and discourse. And I do hope that at least you were able to learn something from here. All right. So thank you all so much for sticking around for another episode of the Shaft Sports, the channel where we bring you thought-provoking discussions on events happening in the world of sports and football. As usual, please click the like button, click the subscribe button. We want to continue to bring you this form of content. And also leave your review below. Do you like for us to bring you more things like this, to discuss more ideas like this? Do you want a level of variation? We really, really, really would love to hear from you, and we really also want to give you the best. Tell us what you think about our new logo and also our new jingle below. Shout outs to all of those who have constantly worked to keep the Shaft podcast going. And I see that this new channel is also really, really growing. So you have my heart in this instance. All right, that's all from me. My name is Erasmus, and see you within the next episode. Thank you.